The next paper is by Dr. Nazia Akhtar, who is from IIIT Hyderabad. She's an assistant professor there, and she's going to speak on Dream, Mirror, Trance, Reality and Reform in the Writings of Sughra Humayun Mirza, 1884 to 1958.
Thank you so much, Charu. Tech support, can I have my PowerPoint, please? Okay, I'd like to start with thanks. I'd like to thank Margaret Pernau for inviting me to speak at this workshop. To be perfectly honest, I didn't know why she had invited me, because my entire work is on Hyderabad. I don't know anything about the context of Jamia. In fact, I've learned it's a good thing that my paper is at the very end, because I've spent the last 2 days learning. So when I asked Margaret, she said that no, we also want to know what else is happening in the country around the same time. Well, a lot is happening in Hyderabad. I have a book on this. It's called Bibi's Room, Hyderabadi Women and 20th Century Urdu Prose, in which I chart a 150-year-old history of only women's prose. There's also women's poetry in Urdu from Hyderabad. There's also social, educational history. There's a history of women's political activism in Hyderabad. So there's a lot that's comparable. So there are just so many little things that I will not, spend time in kind of explaining. So many things, so many different parallels that I've seen from, one day to the next between Hyderabad and Jamia and Aligarh and Lucknow. Everything that is happening. So once again, I will reiterate my call for, I think, comparative work across regions that I had made in the very first session yesterday. I'm also happy to take a lot of questions about Hyderabad from anyone who's interested after my presentation. So I think I'll start now. Can we have the next slide, please? I'll move it. Okay. Sughra Humayun Mirza was a reformer, educator, journalist, writer, and traveler who worked in the erstwhile princely state of Hyderabad, Deccan. She was born to Maryam Begum, a renowned scholar of Persian and Arabic, who would give her daughter an excellent education at home, and Haji Safdar Ali Mirza, who was a military surgeon and a renowned Sufi from Bihar. Haji Safdar Ali was one of many men from other parts of the subcontinent who would migrate and settle in Hyderabad, motivated by an encouraging policy introduced by Salar Jung I, Diwan of Hyderabad, to employ educated professionals from British India to work in administration, education, and medicine. At 16, Sughra Begum married a barrister called Humayun Mirza, who was also a migrant from Azimabad, which is present-day Patna, and a reformer. She became prominent in the social reform movement in Hyderabad, which had emerged in the late 19th century, and campaigned vocally for the education of girls and women and the easing of rigid and oppressive norms of Parda. Margaret Pernau has connected these reform efforts to class-based aspirations of the migrant professionals of Hyderabad. She has argued that as bearers and guardians of culture, women were found to be central to the fashioning of a new identity for these migrants. This is because Hyderabad was dominated by the old nobility who looked down upon these migrants, labeling them ghair mulki or non-mulki. And, these migrants, most of them became active in the reform movement. And in doing so, turned to their bourgeois values to forge a class-based identity around education and personal achievement, as opposed to birth status or wealth. In doing so, they claimed for themselves a respectability or sharafat that was different from and probably even seen as superior to that of the nobility. It was in this context that it became important to educate women, and the associational work and writings of middle-class men and women of non-mulki origin played a vital role in endorsing and ceaselessly promoting this education in Hyderabad. Oh, that went fast. The first Urdu journal to be published for women in Hyderabad was founded by a non-mulki reformer called Muhib-e-Hussain, who had arrived in Hyderabad in 1877. His Muallim-e-Niswan consistently championed women's education and criticized the practice of parda, and became very popular amidst reformist families. but condemnation from the majority of Hyderabadi readers ultimately forced Hussain to cease publication. Among the younger generation of women who came a couple of decades after, who began journals of their own, were Tayyaba Bilgrami and Sughra Humayun Mirza. Both came from reformist families of non-Mulki origin and became prolific writers and journalists, powerful orators, and the force behind several Parda associations that undertook critical social work. Together with her friend and older contemporary, Sughra Begum established reform associations and campaigned energetically for women's and girls' education, both through these associations and through her writing and journalism, which was often conducted through these Parda associations. Not moving. Yeah. It always jumps one. Yeah. Pernau has found these developments in literature and journalism to constitute a literary movement among the women of Hyderabad. Amina Tehseen also writes that women's writing grew gradually in this period because writing became an important medium through which the social and educational progress of women came to be conducted. Okay. It is in this context of reform that Sughra Begum harnesses the power of literature, deploying creative writing for her reformist ends. She is believed to be the first woman novelist writing in Urdu in Hyderabad, with no less than 14 novels to her credit. Her takhallus as a ghazal poet was Haya, and she wrote stories that were published under the label of Qissa and Kahani, and which the scholar Ashraf Rafi has identified as an early form of the Urdu afsana. In addition to this, she wrote rigorously detailed and insightful accounts about her many travels across India, Europe, and the Middle East. These were published serially in An-Nisa, a magazine that she had founded under the aegis of the Anjuman-e-Khawateen-e-Dakkan, which was also established by her. And in fact, this is what Asad, you and I were talking about yesterday, that, Hind was, we should check if Hind was the first political weekly to be edited by a woman, or generally, because this An-Nisa, for instance, starts in 1919. So, but it doesn't become a political journal, it doesn't carry political news until 1927, when Sughra Begum moves to Lahore, and she's not under the gaze of the Nizam, so you can have political content. So it might be worth looking into that. And these travel accounts are also published in other journals and later compiled into a set of 6 books. The literary aspects of Sughra Begum's writing are frequently overlooked and undermined because she so evidently and singularly deployed her writing to convey her reformist agenda. Certainly, the main purpose and motivation behind her writings was to facilitate social reform. But in fact, this immediate objective does not preclude literary creativity and innovation on her part. And as I will show, her reformist message would not be so successfully and powerfully communicated were it not for the power of her literary imagination in wielding the resources of fiction and non-fiction to her particular ends. Specifically, I would like to draw your attention to 2 works of fiction, a novel called Mohini, which she published in 1929, and an intriguing little text called Bibi Tori Ka Khwab, which is usually classified as a short story and was published in 1952. I would also like to use as a point of departure 2 specific images from her travel account, Safarnama-e-Europe, which I believe offer critical insights and bolster my argument. Okay. Sughra Begum published Mohini in Ismat. The plot revolves around a restless princess called Mohini, who abandons her claim to her father's throne and sets out in search of answers to questions that are beyond material or worldly trappings. While Mohini is consistently firm about her lack of political ambition or worldly desire, the specific motivation for her quest eludes the reader and remains unclear until much later. Her elusiveness is paralleled in the figure of an evasive sadhu who appears and disappears at will, even feigning his death in order to avoid her persistent questions. Later, a darwish urges Mohini to let the sadhu go and volunteers to assist her instead. Mohini sets the dervish a long list of questions. Why does death exist? She asks him. Why were good and evil created? Why do youth and old age exist? Why is wealth considered good and poverty bad? Why is there distinction between a poor man's child and a rich man's child? If God decides our destiny, then why are we punished for our actions? The dervish's answers range from those that draw on mystical ideas and theological concepts, such as reincarnation, karma, and the lives and deeds of souls in other worlds, to those that constitute social and cultural problems, such as conspicuous consumption or gender discrimination and patriarchy. The dervish then acts as a spiritual teacher and a local guide, and he advises Mohini to go to Takht-e-Suleiman in Iran, because that is where he has found answers, and that is where she will also find answers. At Takht-e-Suleiman, Mohini is instructed by a faqir at the summit to recite a powerful prayer to enable her to find the answers that she seeks. Thus, she finds her soul transported to another world while her body stays on the mountain. And in this other world, there's a conference of souls. And there are celebrities, and there are all kinds of people. There are religious figures. There are great reformers. And there is a representative of Fatima, daughter of the Prophet, who initiates a resolution to end the practice of parda. This resolution is passed, as well as others involving a ban on polygyny and a concerted effort to ensure widow remarriage. Mohini weeps when she meets her dead husband's soul. And we find out that it is the grief of his loss that had originally compelled her to reject the world and ask persistent questions about the meaning of life and death. He informs her that he cannot return with her, but instead he tells her that he will be reborn as her son once she remarries. He also entrusts her with 3 tasks: ensure that other widows get married, get parda restrictions eased, and facilitate harmony between Hindus and Muslims. So quite a tall order for one princess. With a clearly outlined sense of purpose, Mohini returns to Hindustan, fulfills these promises, and lives a successful and happy life. Okay. Bibi Tori Ka Khwab is prefaced by the author's concern for social apathy and lack of social consciousness, and her wish that Bibi Tori's dream would rouse every man and woman to make their lives a success. It tells the story of Bibi Tori, who's an affluent young Hyderabadi woman who has a dream in which she sees herself undertaking a journey that brings her to a mountain, from whose peak emanates smoke and a weak and painful voice. At the summit, she finds a beautiful caged bird which is screaming loudly, smoke spilling from its beak. After some negotiation that involves brandishing a revolver before a well-built young man, Bibi Tori is able to secure the release of the bird. And now begins a series of episodes of functions, to borrow from Vladimir Prop's formalist reconstruction of the structure of a fairy tale. And these episodes are directed by the talking bird. Bibi Tori rescues and assumes responsibility for a destitute young woman and her aged weeping mother, convincing the self-respecting young woman to accept her help by telling her that actually she's doing her a favor because God has blessed her with the opportunity to help someone. In the next house, she comes across orphaned children and their destitute mother, whom once again she takes charge of. There are many things that happen like this, which include, the lesson that you can be a devout and a pious person, but you should also be a good person. If you're good, you will receive the best in the afterlife. If you're bad, you will receive hell. There are also ascetics that she comes across, as well as a murshid. And the way these men are depicted is as those who have lost their way and have become decadent and spoiled and need to be roused in order to do something about their respective communities. Finally, Bibi Tori turns her attention to the bird, who turns out to be a good and pious woman, once again, who had been rewarded for her goodness by being made a free bird, but who was later imprisoned until Bibi Tori had liberated her for unjustly suspecting a maid of stealing. On waking, Bibi Turi requests her mother, the Rakshanda Begum, to interpret the dream for her or send it to Maulana Khwaja Hasan Nizami, who, as we know, was a Chishti Sufi of considerable prominence. This signals how seriously they take Bibi Turi's dream. And the Rakshanda Begum calls it auspicious and Mubarak and all of that. And congratulates her for being chosen to work in the service of God's creation. She informs Bibi Turi that she will be free like the bird and as powerful if she helps people. God will give her whatever she wants, she says. She gives her permission to go and help the poor and tells her not to worry about being a wife or a mother, but nevertheless reminds her to take her husband's permission before embarking on this endeavor. Have I forgotten a slide? No, I haven't. Consider yourself to be like the earth. The Rakshanda Begum advises her daughter. It is from earth that trees grow, providing shade and fruits and flowers. From all of this, your repute, izzat, will grow. What is particularly striking for me in both these texts, Mohini and Bibi Turi Ka Khwab, is that the vision, agenda, and even manifesto for social reform is imagined and established not in a realistic depiction and setting, but through genres such as fantasy and devices such as dreams and trances. The wellspring from which the discourse and agenda for social reform emerges is not that of rational thought or contemplation in these texts, but of experiences that defy reason and are situated in the realm of the subconscious, which we know to be the repository of the illicit and what is not acknowledged to be rational, or in the realm of the mystical, neither of which can be empirically verified or frankly objectively validated or justified. In my view, it is crucial that it is not through realistic representation and rational argument, but through mystical experience and total suspension of reality that Sughra Begum's reformist agenda is expressly and unequivocally stated in Mohini and Bibi Turi Ka Khwab. It is also when Mohini transcends the real world that she finds closure, clarity, and a sense of purpose that allows her to return fully and meaningfully to her family and realm through personal and social transformation. The roots of revelation are beyond the rational. Why does Sughra Begum do this? Why is it that it is only in an experience beyond the rational that the social reform agenda can reveal itself? Why is it only through such experiences beyond the rational that the social reform agenda can be known and validated for action? Let me suggest two intertwined readings to understand this depiction. Nothing is happening. Okay, yes, we have to go back. I need slide 10. Can you come to I think this is slide 10. Yeah. First, it is important to consider Sughra Begum's readership. Ismat magazine introduces Mohini to its readers in December 1929 as an instructive ethical novel meant for the veiled ones. For Bibi Turi Ka Khwab, which she published herself, Sughra Begum had a broader audience in mind. She dedicates it to Mehdi Nawaz Jung, a Mulki Hyderabadi who was secretary to the Executive Council in the Nizam's government and later a democratically elected minister after Hyderabad's accession to the Indian Union. Mohini is dedicated to her father, who was a Sufi, as we had discussed earlier. She dedicates it to Mehdi Nawaz Jung, the second text, because he loves and serves the poor, is God-fearing, and loves his country and community. She prays that readers like the text and that it awakens them from the dream of oblivion, khwab-e ghaflat, to make their lives successful. Every man and woman should read it, she says. Okay. Now, the medium of fantasy storytelling allows Sughra Begum to tap into texts and contexts, in fact, a milieu that her readers, mostly veiled Muslim women, could already be expected to know. This includes things like Qissa and Kahani. I'm going to skip this. Christina Oesterheld, apart from other scholars such as C.M. Naeem, most recently Pasha M. Khan, M. Asaduddin, Jennifer Dubrow have all worked on this. The connections between previous genres of oral storytelling and performative traditions and the early Urdu novels. So I will not rehearse that in the interest of time. There are many features associated with these older traditions that we also see in Mohini and Bibi Turi Ka Khwab, and which may already be evident to you. So let me just skip that and come to the dream and trances. So the dream and the trance are narrative elements and strategies that would be familiar to Sughra Begum's readers through the world of epic fantasy storytelling. But more importantly, these texts seek legitimacy and draw from the authority of other branches of knowledge. Like other reformist writers, Sughra Begum did not denigrate branches of knowledge and sources of experience that did not abide by a rationalist epistemology, such as mysticism, religion, or supernatural mysteries, but accorded them the same space in texts that were deeply etched with a tension between realism and fantasy, and gives them equal space with branches of knowledge that employed and demanded the use of the intellect. Trances are common experiences in Sufi mysticism, and this line of thought is already validated by the dedication in Mohini to her father. Dreams too have relevance in Islam and are considered to be a form of spiritual perception. There are different categorizations of dreams, one of which is vision, and various hadiths quote the Prophet as saying that good dreams are visions from Allah that are akin to prophecy. There is also, of course, the well-known dream of the Prophet Ibrahim in the Quran, in which he is instructed to sacrifice his son, which he proceeds to attempt only to have his hand stayed by God. In other words, once dreams offering divine direction are seen, it is a believer's responsibility to fulfill its vision. As Darakhshanda Begum informs Bibi Turi, this is a revelation that God has sent to you. This is not a dream, but a revelation. It is your duty to fulfill it. You have a high status before God. That is why you saw such a dream. Otherwise, no one can remember such long dreams. Dream interpretation or tabir or tafsir, which Darakhshanda Begum undertakes on behalf of Bibi Turi, is also an established discipline or science in medieval Islam. Ibn Arabi, Ibn Sirin, and Ibn Khaldun have offered classifications of dreams and written about different kinds of dreams and how they are meant to be interpreted. I argue thus that by employing strategies such as mystical trances and good dreams to outline a social reform agenda, Sughra Begum harnesses the authority of faith and religion as a persuasive rhetorical strategy to move and propel her readers. The mission for social reform is delivered through strategies that may have been as effective or more effective than rational argument or logical reasoning in convincing women. This is not to say, by the way, that rational argument or logical reasoning does not find space and representation in Sughra Begum's other novels. It does, and there are novels which Margaret has worked on. There are novels that she writes that draw from logic and rational argumentation to make the case for reform. But what I am trying to suggest is a somewhat liberal parallel. Is that slide 14? Yes. Is a liberal parallel with or to Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's argument about the famous novels produced by the Bronte sisters, in which they posit that the mad woman in the attic represents repressed desires and aspirations that cannot be embodied in the figure of the angel in the house. And I'm kind of seeing and hearing Nishat and what she said yesterday about the emotional and the rational, kind of trying to extend that here. Perhaps mystical experiences such as trances and subconscious experiences such as dreams are one legitimizing medium through which the desire for social reform can emerge for respectable women. In some ways, mystical experience and subconscious vision are akin to the mirrors that so fascinated Sughra Begum when she visited an amusement park in Berlin. She spends 2 months in Berlin. Mirrors that distorted the real. So she's fascinated by mirrors that make her look, taller or longer, stretch her, person and kind of reduce. She's endlessly fascinated with these mirrors that she sees. Stretching or contracting her face this way and that. But in doing so, allowing her the perspective to look at herself in 100 different ways. Ways that she would never have seen before or imagined herself as. This experience where the image of the self is altered, unstable, and constantly shifting in the hundreds of reflections that play with the nature of reality and perception is particularly effective in helping us understand the role of mystical experience and subconscious vision in providing clarity, direction, and perspective. I need just 5 minutes. I'm about to conclude before you write your 5-minute chit. Okay. So here, social reform is explicitly depicted as divinely desired, sanctioned, and even legitimized. It is the duty of every individual to undertake social reform and social work, not because reason makes it inevitable and logical, but because of the higher authority of Allah. This is also seen in the indirect endorsement of social reform by Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, and the ideal of womanhood for Shia women. And Sughra Humayun Mirza was a devout Shia woman whose representative speaks on her behalf at the Conference of the Souls. This is also why Bibi Turi is guided by a bird, which has long been an agent of Allah and Allah's heroes in both the Quran as well as canonical Perso-Arabic literature and culture. This is also why again and again it is the mystics that Mohini encounters who dismiss her search for answers to questions that are metaphysical, philosophical, and ethical, and instead urge her to return to the world of the living and work for the empowerment of women. I have another reading of this which I will not go into, but perhaps we can come back to that later. To quote Sughra Begum herself, on her departure from London to Amsterdam during her long European travels, and this is a fantastic picture of hers, which is not great resolution, but I still thought it was worth getting it, because she's wearing Western dress and high heels and stockings with a burqa that reaches her up to her waist. This is how she traveled through Europe. So she says, when they're about to depart from London and go to Amsterdam, ख्वाब अब तमाम हो चुका, गोया हमने एक ख्वाब देखकर आंखें खोली. Both real travel and dream travel are means to an end for a reformer. And sooner or later, one must awaken to undertake action or movement. Yesterday, Ritu Menon stressed the importance of going beyond compensatory history to explore what is qualitatively different about women's writing. I think that what I have found radical and different in Sughra Humayun Mirza's work is her deployment of the adventure quest and the creation of an epic heroine. Not a good homemaking woman and mother, although ultimately that is what both heroines are expected to be, and in 1929 and even in 1952, you can't depart from that norm too much. And there's a clear tension about this in both texts. So, and both the adventure quest and the creation of the epic heroine is done in the service of social reform. I find this fascinating. Mohini herself frequently does not resemble a realistic character, both in terms of the range of her physical abilities, her intellectual capacities, as well as her mystical powers. Going to skip this bit a little bit. It's worth remarking on that she's repeatedly thwarted by her family and her subjects in her efforts to reject her claim to the throne and discard her familial and social bonds. Even the Darwesh, like Darakshanda Begum and Bibi Turi, even the Darwesh insists on her securing her parents' permission before traveling with him in search of answers. Mohini pointedly refuses, and this is what I find different and interesting, declaring that she wants to be an ascetic, like the 8th century Sufi Ibrahim Adham, or go into exile like Raja Ramchandra. It is apparent that while Mohini's subsequent enthusiasm for social reform is considered desirable, her itinerant lifestyle is not depicted in the text as worthy of emulation and is seen, in fact, as part of a malaise that needs a cure. Last slide. In some ways, then, Sughra Begum's Mohini as well as Bibi Turi Ka Khwab are classic reformist texts with formal features, social attitudes, and ethical and moral positions that closely resemble those that are found in the canon of reformist texts by women and men writing in this period, in Hyderabad as well as elsewhere. In other ways, however, they diverge markedly from this canon in their unusual portrayal of restless and adventurous heroines one of them distinctly inclined to asceticism, who sets out on a quest for mystical knowledge or guidance towards a life well lived. This premise is hardly the norm for fantastic storytelling in Urdu or Persian, where there may be strong women characters and magical agents, but women who renounce society and family for personal spiritual ends are few and far in between. Both texts not only draw from existing tropes, genres, and textual and religious or faith based traditions and sources of knowledge and authority, which is all familiar, popular, and reliable terrain for a reformer to tread, but also exceed their scope to further the discourse of individuality and agency for women in the early and mid 20th century. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. This was absolutely a fascinating paper, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Let me just flag one or two very fragmentary and broad comments, and then we can open the floor for discussion. So let me comment on the first paper first by Fatima Rizvi. So I think all the three women that you're talking about are remarkable women, but the question that comes into one's mind is that just seeing a linear march of women participating, of doing reformist endeavors, of doing away with parda, how do we go beyond that? I mean, are these signatures of proto-feminist consciousness, as has been remarked, or do they signal the coming together of religion and communism in very interesting ways in Razia Sajad's account? I mean, Anya Lumba has talked about revolutionary desires, in that she talks about how while there is this kind of tension between communism and religion, but they also function in tandem, and then how as a communist, and perhaps I don't know if she's an atheist or a religious, or practicing religion, how does she deal with questions of communist patriarchy? So I think that in just seeing this as a linear march, perhaps we need to then also place it in terms of the kind of proto-feminist politics, and then in terms of liberation theology. And I think what does that do? Coming to Nazia's very fascinating paper, I think one question that I would have for both is, what are there regional variations? What is happening in Hyderabad and Lucknow, and what is happening in Delhi and Aligarh? Do we see similar trajectories, or do we see some kind of regional variations there? But coming specifically to Nazia's paper, I think in both the papers, travel becomes a very important idiom. And I think and in some ways, travel is also something exotic. It's also going beyond your domestic sphere. So just like the dream, or just like, say, a kind of adventure, or a kind of otherworldly, I think travel also has an element of that. And it's interesting that many of the protagonists of the first paper and the second paper use travel as a very important idiom. And I think there is a lot of work now, Daniel Markowitz's work and, other kinds of work which have emerged on women travelers, writing in Urdu. So I think the trope of travel really coincides with the trope of something which is beyond domesticity, which is beyond the home, which is beyond. So I think that would be interesting. And it's interesting that dream, it takes your archive, it really expands your archive. When you enter the soul, and the dream becomes your central paradigm. But I think it is also, how, the classic test, Sultana's dreams or something, it immediately comes to your mind that how dreams become metaphors to say, something much more which cannot be said, in the rational world. So how the quest for the other, something exotic, something beyond, becomes the way to speak the unspeakable. So I think that's important. But I open the floor for discussion. Yeah, please. let's just take all the questions, and then maybe each can respond to whatever you feel like responding.
May I just say something?
Okay, so let them give them.
The questions first?
Okay, let's take all the questions first, and then okay. Okay, first Saida, then Ritu, and then okay.
I just want to say, these two papers, somehow I very personally relate to them. Fatma has talked about Begum, Inam, Fatma, but Habibullah, Razia Sajjad Zahir, and Qudsiya Izaz Rasool. We had 5 years ago, we did this one big exhibition on 20th century women, and all three women were, I didn't know the depth which you know, but I have three of my colleagues sitting here who were part of this exhibition, and we featured them, and all three, these three women featured in it. Only Razia is behind you, and Begum Habibullah is there, but her daughter-in-law was in our exhibition, right? Right? So,
Two daughters-in-law,
Atiya and Hamida were there. Privilege. I just want to ask you about privilege. They're all very privileged, and yet you think about Razia, and we know what Razia's background was, and how privileged her husband was, and how he totally gave up, and as a result of that, you said he lived in a small quarter in Justice Wazir Hassan's house. I mean, that shows. So then how they were able to, connect with the most marginalized. So very quickly, and of course your paper was something again, multi-layered, and Nazia spoke about things which I really never even occurred to me. All my life I have seen this, what you have shown, Mohini, Sughra Humayun Mirza's Mohini, and the fact that she dedicated Bibi Tori Ka Khab to Nawab Mehdi Nawaz Jung. They were all like my bachpan ki yadein. And to this day, I have my mother's copy of exactly that book that you have shown, that Mohini, that particular Rashidul Khairi, and all of that you have shown. So, I mean, I really want to thank you, because I've just looked at it at a distance and felt very, very formidable, but, it opens up a lot. So, Fatma and Nazia, thank you.
So let's just take all the questions, and then I'll give you 10 minutes to respond to that. Any more questions? Anybody has any comments, immediate questions, comments, anything? Yeah, Francesca?
Thank you both for the wonderful papers. It's a bit of an open question. Hearing Nazia's, kind of modern woman-centered quest story with all the, the echoes that you suggest, and it, I think we were all transported. I wonder whether, why, or if any others know whether this was a more widespread. I think we hear, as you said, we hear a lot about social, realistic, narratives of various kinds. We've heard yesterday, we've heard today, and this seems to be quite different. And I wonder whether it's a question of the other narratives or the other forms in the women's journals where, scholars have not paid attention to them, but actually they are there. Or what was special about Sughra Humayun Mirza, who otherwise seemed to be doing what all the other women were doing.
Okay, Ritu. Yeah. And so let's take this as the last question, and then I'll give the floor to you, and then we can come back to the second round of questions.
Very fascinating, really, both of them, both presentations. Nazia, I was just wondering, this business of dreams and so on, Charu, of course, has mentioned Sultana's dream and so on. But I was thinking much more of something that Mernisi has been doing, Fatima Mernisi, where she speaks of the dream as the area of trespass, not of reform, not of realizing a social agenda or a social reformist impulse, but of trespass. And I was struck by that when you were describing Bibi Tur Ka Khwab, because actually it seems to me that she is very close to that threshold of trespassing. I wonder whether that might be something that you could explore, because when Fatima wrote Women in Muslim Paradise, for example, what was she doing? She was trespassing. It was not simply something that was shocking or unimaginable, but she was actually interrogating that whole notion of a paradise for women. And how could she do it? Simply when she, through that dream trespass. I don't know, it just struck me while I was listening.
Okay, so I request the two speakers each to respond, briefly, and if then we can take a second round of questions. Okay, so whoever wants to go first. Okay,
So
okay.
I'll start with
Nazia.
I'll start with Ritu's point. I think absolutely, I agree, and I think that trespass is a very useful way of looking at this, because you have to understand. I mean, reform at this point is in Hyderabad, and Sughra Humayun Mirza is someone who's remarkably privileged. She's wealthy, she's extremely beautiful. She comes from a family which has a lot of social, cultural, and capital. So, she's not someone who's going to be easily intimidated. But there is a man just a couple of decades before her has been forced to shut down his magazine. That is how social reform was viewed, and this continues until, I mean, in 1950 or thereabouts, Jilani Bano, when she sends a story to be published in a magazine in Bombay, her uncle objects, saying, "Ab paraye mard isko khat bhejenge." I mean, that was the fear. So I mean, these kinds. So I think, social reform is a transgressive demand. So I think it can only be expressed in the repressed, in a space where you kind of bring out repressed things. So I think that I find that very useful. Thank you so much for pointing that out. And since you talk about interrogating the notion of paradise, I mean, I'm immediately struck by another Hyderabadi woman, Zinat Sajida, who wrote an essay called Agar Allah Miyan Aurat Hote, which I have translated in Bibi's Room. So I mean, what is a bigger transgression than questioning that fundamental thing of God will, all the calls and demands of worldly life and society. But I'm trying to think if there are progressive writers have done some very interesting work in Hyderabad, which kind of verges on, Jilani Bano, for instance, has, when she starts writing modernist, when she starts experimenting with modernist writing, there's a lot of inward stuff which is very, which is tapping into stream of consciousness, that kind of thing. But I'm trying to think of this earlier period, this earlier generation of women writers, and nothing immediately comes to mind. But this could also just be, lack of research on my part, and I need to kind of explore that further, and maybe we can communicate more about this later. So.
Thank you for the questions, and to your point, Charu, about the proto-feminism. Yeah, can you hear me now? No? Yeah, better? Yeah, okay. So talking about this whole idea of proto-feminism, I think, yes, these women were proto-feminists. And with regard to their politics, it was, of course, a feminist politics, but they were also trying to, enter into political spheres that were just opening up for women. And these are among the earliest women legislators in the council, etc. As regards Razia Sajjad Zahir, there is no such entering into a political sphere. But her politics is about the Marxist politics that was, running contrary to all these ideas about the Muslim League and about the Indian National Congress. So, and I mean, I pointed out that Sajjad Zahir was often on the run, or he was, imprisoned, etc. So, with Razia Sajjad Zahir and her husband, it was a lived politics of Marxist ideology. And they actually lived in the outhouse. I mean, this is not my word, it is Noor Zahir's word. When she writes her obituary for her mother, she writes that they were 4 sisters and हम लोग अपने छोटे से outhouse से निकल के आते थे. My mother, who was also studying at Karamat and traveled by bus to the school, was witness to the fact that Razia Sajjad Zahir and her daughters came out of the outhouse when they went to school. So it was, they were actually believing in the principles and living those principles also. And of course, I mean, they had nothing, preventing them from living good, comfortable lives. But also about, how they propagated their politics, all 3 women. With regard to Inam Fatma, I think she wrote the travelogue because educating young Muslim women was an ideal that was very close to her. It was very dear to her. And so she writes the travelogue with the intent of educating them. It's a very realistic work and in no way idealistic. In many ways, it is referring to, as I pointed out, comparing situations, seeing how things can get better for women. And yes, one of my references is 3 centuries of Muslim women's travel. So with her, it is about that. And then the religious treatise that she writes for her grandchildren, and which I didn't talk about for paucity of time, is again, a religious politics and a religious way of reform. So for her, religion was very close to the heart, and she was seeking to reform within the tenets of the religion. And she was seeing the religion as a kind of, I would say, not as regressive as it is made out to be. She was pointing out the more erudite aspects of the religion. As regards Qudsiya Ezaz Rasool, well, she did not write any novel as such, but I think she asserted herself by means of her autobiography. And it's literally a very, very, it's an autobiography that is more political than personal, from the point of view of what she did, how she overcame, barriers, etc. To some extent, I would say, I don't like to say this, but nevertheless, a little self-congratulatory, but nevertheless, I mean, she was the one who was actually doing those things. She was out there and she was making all the decisions and helping them come into being. So, again, a very realistic kind of fiction coming out of her pen also. And I chose to work on these 3 women because, you see, Lucknow was a space which was very dynamic. And yet it was one of those, what shall I say, a backward space, still is believed to be a backward space. Many of the women we've been talking about since yesterday come from Lucknow and adjoining, regions, districts. And here were women who were, some of them, of course, Inam Fatma was from Kakori, an adjoining district, but the other 2 had come from outside into Lucknow, and they were living in Lucknow and, affecting change in Lucknow. So it was a very dynamic space. And over the years, it was these women who were trying to affect change. How much they were actually able to affect is a question anybody may ask. But again, about privilege. So it was the privileged women who ultimately had the power to bring about the change. I wish I could have included, stories of women who were less privileged and who were bringing about change or trying to bring about change. But this was a time when privileged women did try to bring about a change for the rest of the community. I mean, they had the larger good at the community in mind, and they proposed change for it. As regards the communism that you talked about of Razia Sajjad Zahir, so she's known to have remarked, I am a Shia first. So I am a Shia first. I am a Shia first. And then a communist, of course. I mean, I need not say that. So even with regard to Sajjad Zahir's burial, there was this thing about would he be buried in the Muslim way or what would happen? So she insisted that he would be buried in the Muslim Shia way. And so it was a politics which was, of course, I haven't researched as much as to be able to actually say whether it was a reactionary kind of politics after he came back to Lucknow, because in London, of course, he had been actually ingratiated gradually into the communist fold. What he did in India, whether it was why was he in the outhouse? I'm actually referring to that. Why was he in the outhouse of his house and not in the main building? That is a question that anybody can, look into. More so because his mother was so much of such a dynamic figure and so involved in politics. Also, that she was often, crossing with Inam Fatma Habibullah. Often they did not agree on several things, and so thank you.
Okay, you want to say something? Yeah.
So I also wanted to come back to the points that you had made, just two of them. The first about travel being an important idiom. I think yes, and that book that just came out, 300 Years of Travel Writing, edited by Sunil Sharma, Siobhan Lambert, and Daniel Makrovich, is very important. And
Daniel's new book, which is just
there's another one that's come out. Yes, so I think that book makes an argument that these women were there, all these Muslim women traveling, and they subvert, and not only subvert but actually annihilate the hegemonic image of the traveler as quintessentially white, male, virile, colonizing, all of that. I think Sughra Humayun Mirza does it. Sometimes I think it's totally innocently, but she does it brilliantly. And not only does she do that, as a woman traveler, intrepid, encyclopedic detail, so insightful and rigorous in her analysis of institutions that she visits in Germany and France and so on. But in her observations of Europe and Europeans, there is an estranging of Europe that I find very interesting, because Europe has been made familiar by Western travelers to whom it was familiar. So her observations that in Germany men are tall but horses are short or small, and in London it's the other way around. All of that estranges Europe, and it does something very radical and subversive. So that is one thing. And the other thing, when you mentioned regional variations, there's a lot that I would like to say, but the one very obvious thing which is visible immediately that I would like to say is that political writing is difficult in Hyderabad in the late 19th century, early 20th, right up to even after police action, because of police action. Because first, there's the Nizam. It's a princely state which is loyal to the British. There's all of that. So Sughra Begum, for instance, it's only when she leaves Hyderabad and goes to Lahore that she begins political reporting and analysis in her journal. And similarly, you have progressive writers who have not written about the integration of Hyderabad, who have, some of them have written about revolution, of course, but some have not even done that, because there's a very significant amount of self-censorship, both because you have the Nizam, but also later on you have this military regime and an unelected Indian government which has been imposed on Hyderabadis. So that is, I think, the most obvious regional variation that I find, and the kind of quality of the princely state and what that demands in terms of responding to an excess of power. So I think I'll stop with that.
So let us dream of a better world. And you want to say something?
To Fatima, I'm just curious whether these women were in conversation with each other, because and how they shared their experiences and their views about women's education. And to Nazia, these motives of travel and dream both are central to Islam also. They are very important motifs in Islam, especially when you look at the Miraj of the Prophet, where the body is here, but the soul travels. So the journey of the soul is and then dream, because one way of looking at dreams is, of course, from Freudian perspective, transgression and all that. But what about the concept of basharat, where you get good news only in dream? So that is another way, perhaps, in which these texts can be looked at. Yeah.
So I think I did mention that. Yeah, I think I mentioned that, the kind of connection to Islam, dreams.
I think this is more of a comment, but if you want to add something, just very quickly.
Because we need to close. Also, there's another program which is lined up. Yeah.
So So I think with those very insightful remarks, we close this 2 days very exciting conference. And as I said, I hope in our dreams we can think of radical changes at least in this world that we are living in. So we'll stop.